transformation of low-level features to high-level object representations, but rather we use context to recognize objects. So for example, for this object here, does any of you have any idea what this could be? No guesses? So this is, I'll show you now. Is it clear now? Do you see what it is? Or is it still not clear? I hope it is. Yeah. So this is a car on a highway at night. Poor viewing conditions, but I think at least on my monitor, I can very clearly see that this is a truck. And I also even see roughly, you know, where the tires are, where the front and the back of the truck is, etc. And so this is a situation we might encounter. This is, of course, a bit of an extreme situation, but often we are confronted with scenes containing many objects, and often these objects are in the periphery, or they're partly occluded, or we don't have attention for them, but we can still recognize them based on context. Impressionist painters have used this to great effect as well. So, for example, in this painting, you recognize this object as a ship, but when you actually go very close to the painting, you see that's just a few brushes of paint. Or when you crop it out of the painting, like here, you see that it doesn't contain any local features that make it identifiable as such. But in the context of the painting, it makes a lot of sense. So this is in contrast to the kind of object recognition that most studies have investigated based on low-level local features. So for example, here, the same truck, isolated from the background, is still very easily recognizable based on the local features. So in our first study, we wanted to provide some behavioral evidence for this facilitating role of context. And in this study, participants were asked to categorize objects as being either animate or inanimate. So they saw like a degraded object like this one, and they had to indicate if it's animate or inanimate. Well, I think you'll probably find this pretty hard for this particular object. But when we put it in its context, then typically people find it quite easy. So here you see the design was super simple study, just fixation, very brief presentation of an object either in context or outside of context, and then the response, whether it was animate or inanimate. And what we find here on the left are the degraded conditions, so the conditions that I've just shown you, is that the detection accuracy here on the y-axis relative to chance is much higher when the object is presented within the scene, the orange bar, than when it's presented alone. And this is, you know, not surprising. This is the effect of context helping you to recognize the object. This effect is reduced when the object is intact, when it has all the local features clearly visible. Then recognition is already quite easy, even when it's outside of the scene context. And you see also that if you compare the intact blue condition with the degraded orange condition, so the degraded object in a scene is recognized nearly as accurately as an intact object outside of a scene. So the context can compensate for the degradation that we applied to the object. So now the question is, how does this work in the brain? And one general view in the context of predictive processing is that we combine visual input that might be blurry, for example, peripheral visual input, with our expectations and knowledge, and in a way that sharpens the representation of the input. So this is a general predictive processing framework that's been very influential, and I think very familiar to many of you. But again, how does this actually work in the brain in the specific example of context-based object recognition? Here's another way of depicting this predictive processing idea. So in this account, the perception cycle is hypothesized to start with a feed-forward sweep, for example, a sensory input of keys that is traveling through the visual system from low-level to high-level visual areas, activating some memory systems. And that's followed directly by a feedback sweep, where there is a hypothesis testing process going on, where the top-down prediction is matched against the bottom-up input finally resulting in this resonance stage where the hypothesis is confirmed or rejected, leading then to conscious recognition. So this is again in the context of, this is a model, of course, it's not data, and it's in the context of a single object activating an hypothesis. But in the case of context-based object recognition, the feedback or the hypothesis actually comes from interaction between the object and the scene. So it creates quite a different situation than what is depicted here. And that is because objects and scenes are processed in different brain regions in the visual system. So many of you might be familiar with this, but I will briefly recap these object and scene selective processing systems. So when we have this image of a scene, we can distinguish between the objects in the scene, which are potentially movable entities that you can act upon and are defined by local properties, and the scene itself, which is the background elements that you act within, defined by global properties. And the scenes might be recognizable even when you blur it. So seems like quite driven by low spatial frequencies. When you blur a scene, you might still recognize roughly what category of scene it is, but you may no longer recognize individual objects. And there's been lots of work showing that objects and scenes are processed in different brain regions that are selective for either objects or scenes. So classically, there are these two regions, the lateral occipital cortex and the posterior fusiform gyrus regions, where you see the selective response to intact objects as compared to scrambled versions of these objects. By contrast, scenes, as compared to objects and also scrambled objects or scrambled scenes, activate a network of regions depicted here in different colors. So the parapicommal place area, occipital place area, and retrosplenial complex. So these regions respond very strongly to scenes particularly, and scene-like objects like houses. And it's not just neuroimaging that shows that these regions just activate to these stimuli. They also are causally involved in discriminating different objects or scenes. So there's been this TMS study that we'll get back to later. So I'll explain it here. This is a study by Dilks and colleagues where they stimulated the object-selective cortex and the scene-selective cortex in different trials while participants were recognizing either objects or scenes. So here you see their paradigm. Participants were fixating. A stimulus was shown that was this kind of degraded stimulus. In this case, was one of 4 objects: camera, chair, car, or shoes. It was presented very briefly, followed by a mask, and participants had to perform a 4 alternative forced choice task, indicating which of the objects they've just seen. And during the object presentation, there was a train of TMS pulses over either LO or OPA. They also had a vertex control condition. And what they find is in line with their expectations, that stimulating LO in this object task impaired performance relative to stimulating the scene-selective OPA or the vertex control. Importantly, when the task was changed to a scene task, so here the task was otherwise, the structure of the task was the same, but the images now came from one of 4 scene categories: beaches, forests, cities, and kitchens. And participants had to discriminate which of these 4 scene categories was shown. Then they found that OPA stimulation rather than LO stimulation impaired performance. So putting these results together, they find this double dissociation with the scene-selective cortex being causally involved in scene recognition and the object-selective cortex being causally involved in object recognition. So that's important causal evidence that these regions are actually processing distinct parts of the visual input. So coming back to the topic of context-based object recognition, knowing that scenes and objects are recognized in or represented in different systems, different brain regions, how do they interact to support context-based object recognition? So here I schematically illustrated the ventral stream, the right ventral stream, the medial pathway leading up to the PPA, the parapicommal place area, and the lateral pathway leading up to the posterior fusiform gyrus, representing objects. As I mentioned before, there are other scene-selective regions and other object-selective regions. So this is just a schematic, but it helps to illustrate possible mechanisms. So I depicted here a scene with a blurry car in it, in this red outline. And the PPA presumably represents the global aspects of the scene, whereas the posterior fusiform gyrus represents this local object in this case. So the question is then, how are these two sources of information combined to result in this accurate recognition of this blurry object as a car? So one option is that these are processed in parallel, both feeding into more anterior systems or decision-making regions where this information is combined, leading to the correct guess or the correct decision that this is a car. So for example, I see a blurry object, I see a street, so probably it's a car, right? This is one possibility. An alternative possibility, more in line with these predictive processing accounts, is that the information in the scene-selective cortex feeds back to the object-selective cortex and disambiguates the representation there. This can be through a direct route, or it might also go through maybe through other regions, possibly even frontal cortex. But in this interactive account, the representation in the object-selective cortex to this blurry car is actually changing as a function of the scene. And one quite specific account of this interactive type is this one by Moshe Bar, where he's proposing that visual input travels through multiple pathways, starting here with this picture of this beach, with this umbrella, starting in early visual cortex regions with high spatial frequencies going to inferior temporal cortex, so corresponding to these object-selective regions, where objects may be recognized based on these local details, and then a low spatial frequency pathway going to the parahippocampal cortex, roughly corresponding to the parahippocampal place area, one of these scene-selective regions, where this likely context is activated, which then feeds back to the inferior temporal cortex to disambiguate and modulate the representation of this object. He also postulates another pathway through the prefrontal cortex, where the object identities are established based on the low spatial frequencies, but I will not go into this now. Okay, so we wanted to find evidence for this account to see whether indeed representations in object-selective cortex are modulated by the scene context. So the first study we used MRI, and participants were just lying in the scanner and reviewing these very briefly presented images. They didn't have to recognize them as such. They had to do some orthogonal task. Occasionally, we flashed up some numbers and they had to press a button just to make sure they were still awake. So in this study, we had 6 conditions. It was a 2x3 design. We had the degraded objects outside of the scene context. We had these same objects in the context, and we had the scenes alone. And we had objects coming from animate domains and inanimate domains. So we had animate objects, inanimate objects, degraded objects in scenes, and the scenes alone. And we use this animacy distinction as a proxy for object representations, for the quality of object representations. So what we had participants do was, before they performed this main experiment, they viewed intact objects, animate and inanimate objects, that were clearly visible and clearly recognizable based on their local features. And we trained the classifier to distinguish between these categories based on multivoxel activity patterns in particular brain regions like the object-selective cortex. And then we tested this classifier on distinguishing these object categories in the main experiment, where these objects were degraded outside of the scene or inside of the scene, or even just the scenes alone. So the question then is the representation of object category as a proxy for object representations, is this representation different for objects when they are in scenes as compared to when they're outside of scenes? And because the classifier was trained to discriminate these intact, very clearly visible objects, we believe that this would index quite a sort of a visual representation of the objects rather than a more conceptual representation. Although we cannot fully distinguish that here, of course. So let's have a look at LO, an object-selective region. What's plotted here is the decoding accuracy relative to chance. So everything above 0 is above chance. So for the individual objects, these degraded objects outside of scene context, which are pretty hard to recognize, we find significantly above chance decoding accuracy. So apparently still something in the shape of the object is correlating with category. So animate objects still look a bit different from inanimate objects, even though they are not so easy to recognize. The scene alone actually is not providing any information about animacy. And that's also because the kind of scenes that we chose were not strongly linked to either animate or inanimate objects. So for example, a field or a road could show a car, but could also show an animal. And of course, scenes are not really processed in this object-selective region anyway, as we've seen from this TMS study. So what you might expect now in this parallel account, where these two systems operate independently of each other, is that the object in the scene is reaching a decoding performance of something like this, like just the sum of the two, right? So if it's just independently processed, this would be sort of the maximum decoding that you might expect. But what we find for these objects presented within scene context is a much higher decoding accuracy. So these objects seem to really be disambiguated by the scene, even though the scene itself did not provide any information about the object, providing support for these interactive models. We see the same in another object-selective cortex region, the posterior fusiform gyrus here. Again, the scene alone does not provide any information about the object, but when the object is presented within the scene, the decoding is much higher than when it's presented outside of the scene. And this is also, in a way, quite surprising because the scene itself might also add a lot of clutter and a lot of information that's not relevant to the category distinction. For example, the outline shape of the object might be informative of object category, but that is partly lost when you put it in the scene. We also ran the same analysis in a whole brain searchlight analysis. So here we test for this difference between the decoding of degraded objects in scenes and the sum of degraded object and scene decoding. And we see that there's quite a large part of the visual cortex that shows this difference. So it's not a small effect. It's not a very localized effect. It's much of the visual cortex is showing much better decoding of this animacy when the objects are presented in the scenes than when they're presented outside of the scenes. Now then we asked whether this decoding in object-selective regions is correlated with activity, concurrent activity in scene-selective areas, as we would predict from these models. So what we did was to take activity in scene-selective regions like the PPA, while participants were viewing these objects in the scenes, and correlate that with the facilitation effect in object-selective regions across participants. And so we see that this correlates positively in all of these scene regions, with the subjects who show more activity in the scene-selective regions also showing a greater facilitation in object-selective cortex due to the scene context. So that provides some support, of course, quite indirect, but some support that there is this interaction between scene-selective regions and object-selective regions. So we could say that these data support this interactive account where the PPA is interacting directly or indirectly with the object-selective cortex, where these representations are disambiguated. Is that clear for everyone? Are there any questions? All right. Then we were wondering about the time course of this effect. So is this something that happens, during initial visual processing, or is it clearly more like a feedback effect? And so to answer this question, we turn to MEG, magnetoencephalography, that has very high temporal resolution. And with MEG, we cannot define individual voxels as we can with MRI, but we can measure the response at a millisecond resolution. And we can use very much the same classification approach also for MEG. And so to come up with some intuition for what time points we might expect, we turned to this study by Chiki and colleagues, where they investigated scene processing with MEG. And what they did was to decode the size of scenes, so whether they are small or large spaces, across a variety of irrelevant image properties. So for example, they would train a classifier to distinguish between small and large scenes with high clutter, and they would test that classifier on distinguishing small from large scenes with low clutter. And they argue that a classifier that can do that is truly representing the size of the scene and not some co-varying irrelevant property. And what they did was to train this classifier at every time point across the sensor, across the many sensors that they measured with MEG, and testing it on that time point as well. So basically, you train this classifier again and again and again on every time point and plot its performance across time. And that's what's shown here. So on the x-axis is the time relative to stimulus onset, and on the y-axis is decoding accuracy for several types of decoding. So they always decoded the size of the scene, but across either clutter, as shown here, contrast, luminance, or image identity. So they were all ways of getting at this rather abstract representation of scene layout. And what they find is that this is possible from around 180 milliseconds up to about 300 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So this gives us some indication that the scene information is extracted around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So any modulatory influence on object representations might happen after that. So we ran our study with MEG. It was exactly the same study as we did in the MRI, just that we now measured MEG instead of MRI activity. And we also ran the same type of decoding analysis. So again, we trained the classifier to discriminate intact animate versus inanimate objects and tested this classifier on our conditions in the main experiment. And again, similar to Chiki and colleagues, we tested and trained this classifier for every millisecond separately. So what I show you here is this is the cross decoding along the diagonal. So that means that the train and test time were the same. We could also look off diagonal, and there's some interesting results there, but that might get a bit too detailed. So this is just the straight decoding where the train time and the test time is the same. So that we train it on the on these isolated intact objects at let's say 50 milliseconds, and we test it also at 50 milliseconds, but now on the conditions in the main experiment. And what we see here, we start from 0 at 0 milliseconds. We see that around 300 milliseconds after stimulus onset, the decoding of the object in scene is significantly higher than the sum of the decoding of the object alone and the scene alone. So the orange line here is significantly higher than the dotted line from around 300 milliseconds after stimulus onset.
I have a question here. So here you use all the channels to do the decoding? Or...
Yes. Yes. I think this was all. We've also done the just the posterior channels, which often actually gives slightly better results. I don't know if this plot here comes from the posterior or all channels, but they typically give similar results. We also have done this analysis separately for the magnetometers and the gradiometers. And what we find typically is for this type of analysis that the magnetometers give more reliable decoding than the gradiometers. Okay, so coming back to this picture, this schematic, it might be the case that then that the scene itself is represented in scene-selective cortex around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset. The object, the blurry object, is represented in object-selective cortex around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset. This was already found in previous work, just focusing on isolated object recognition. And then maybe this disambiguation happens then at around 300 milliseconds, so with a 100 millisecond delay. Okay, so now that was great, but of course, it's possible that these neuroimaging signals that we see, that they correlate with our manipulation, but they might not, of course, causally generate this object percept. So it's very well possible that participants guess the identity of the object based on a more parallel processing of the object and the scene. And then after recognition, they say, ah, that's a car. And then they start to imagine, the details of a car, or they remember a car that they've seen before. And this is what we pick up with neuroimaging methods. So it could be that it's really more the consequence of recognition that we see in MRI and MEG rather than the cause of recognition. So to test whether these signals really contribute to object recognition, we turn to TMS, where we can briefly interfere with activity at particular brain regions. And here, of course, we were again particularly interested in these object and scene selective brain regions. So to start with, we wanted to replicate this Dilks study because that was done in just 13 participants. And we wanted to see if we could replicate that in a larger sample. So we asked them for their scripts and their stimuli, and we did basically exactly what they did, stimulating these object selective cortex and scene selective cortex. Again, here we can only stimulate the OPA. We cannot reach the PPA that is more ventrally and further away from the skull. So we stimulated the OPA just like they did. And we find that for the scene task, that OPA stimulation impaired performance relative to LOC, the object selective cortex, and vertex stimulation. So that was great. And again, we also find the same for the object task. So now stimulating object selective cortex impaired performance relative to stimulating scene selective cortex or vertex. And this really nicely replicated their results in a larger sample and gave us confidence that we can actually target these regions effectively in a way that affects performance. So here you see the effects in our study and comparing to Dilks and our study. What you see here plotted is the difference between task performance during vertex, the control stimulation, and the active TMS site, so either the LO or the OPA stimulation, in terms of a percentage difference. So what you see is that also the effect size estimates are pretty similar to the ones of Dilks and colleagues, just that we had many more subjects and much more significant results. Another thing we observed was that, of course, not everyone shows these effects. We see that 19% of participants don't show either of the effects, so don't show an LO effect and also don't show an OPA effect. Many subjects show both of these effects, and some subjects just show one or the other. And this could have many reasons, of course, can be noise, but it could also be that these regions are just not sensitive to TMS in some subjects relative to others. For example, the location of these regions may be differing across subjects, or maybe the skull is thicker in some subjects or another, or maybe the region is just in a sulcus that is not triggered, that is not targeted effectively with TMS. So there could be many reasons for why this does not work in everybody, but we took this opportunity to ask these subjects to come back who showed an effective TMS in one of these conditions. So, for example, a participant who showed a strong OPA effect was asked to come back to do this context-based recognition task where we stimulated the OPA in that participant. So in a way, we used this as a functional localizer for our main experiment, which was about context-based object recognition. That way, we ensured that TMS was effective for every participant that participated in this main experiment. So this main experiment was again about context-based object recognition, with the main condition of interest being this condition where the object is degraded and put in a scene context. In this case, we compared it with a condition where the object was shown in isolation, but still intact, rather than degraded. as we did in the MRI experiment and the MEG experiment. And this is because in TMS, of course, we measure behavior, we measure object recognition performance. And so we need this to be equated across condition to meaningfully compare these conditions in terms of their sensitivity to TMS. Because if one would be very high accuracy, the other would be very low accuracy, then it's very hard to interpret any TMS effects across conditions. Also, this allowed us now to directly compare the neural systems underlying these two forms of recognition. So we piloted the stimulus set such that recognition performance was equated across these two conditions, such that the scene context compensated for the degradation that we applied to the object. In this case, of course, the focus was on the behavioral performance of the participants. So we had a 8 alternative forced choice task. Participants were again fixating, viewing this stimulus presented very briefly, and then indicated what they have seen in that picture from airplane, mammal, human, boat, bird, car, fish, or train. Here you see a couple more examples. And in the actual TMS data, the performance was on average equated across these two conditions. So the isolated objects were recognized as accurately as the context-based conditions, even though the objects in the context-based condition were heavily degraded. Now we stimulated 3 different regions in different participants, and these participants were selected based on this replication study that I showed you earlier, such that we could stimulate effectively these regions in every participant. So we had the OPA, the scene-selective region, the LOC, and early visual cortex as an additional region. And importantly, we stimulated in a time-specific manner. So rather than having a whole train of pulses, we had just 2 pulses that were delivered at specific time points relative to stimulus onset. So they could be delivered 60 and 100 milliseconds after stimulus onset, 160, 200, or 260, 300 relative to visual presentation. And we had 24 subjects in each of these groups for a total of 72. And because we had very specific predictions based on these neuroimaging data, we could pre-register these predictions. And I'll explain them to you here. They should be quite obvious by now, hopefully. So for the intact object condition, for OPA stimulation, we did not predict any differences across time because OPA is not involved in object recognition, as we've seen. So it shouldn't matter at what time you stimulate OPA, it should not affect performance. This is different for the degraded object in scene, the context-based object recognition condition. In this case, we expect that the OPA is causally involved in recognizing objects because it represents the scene context that is giving the input to the object-selective system later. And specifically, we expect this to happen around 200 milliseconds. Now, when LOC, the object-selective cortex, is stimulated, we expect that stimulating around 200 milliseconds should impair recognition of intact objects, because that's been shown by many studies that object-selective cortex represents objects at around 200 milliseconds. Importantly, for the context-based recognition, we also expect that stimulating it at around 200 milliseconds impairs performance, because object-selective cortex is still representing these degraded features, but it would be even more strongly involved later on when the feedback arrives from scene-selective cortex and when the object is disambiguated. This is around 300 milliseconds, the time point that we've seen in the MEG experiment. Finally, for early visual cortex, we predicted that the early stimulation would affect performance in both tasks, because that's when early visual cortex is processing the visual input in a feed-forward manner. But we expected that for the scene-selective condition, for the scene-based recognition condition, the early visual cortex would still be causally involved a little bit later, because the object needs to be segmented from the background. And there are some studies indicating that that requires some re-entrant processing. All right, so let's see what the results are. These are the actual results. This is for OPA stimulation. So that's very nicely matching what we predicted. So no difference across these time windows for the intact object condition, but a strong decrease in performance when OPA was stimulated in this middle time window, around 200 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So this provides evidence that the scene-selective region is still important for recognizing objects when these objects are facilitated by scene context. When LOC was stimulated, again, the data very nicely matched the predictions. So object-selective cortex impaired performance in the middle time window for both intact object recognition and context-based object recognition. But it's mostly the late time point that is of interest here, that impaired performance only for the context-based recognition, but not for the intact object recognition. Finally, the early visual cortex results, they actually went in the opposite way as what we predicted. So here the intact object recognition condition is impaired also at the middle time window, whereas the context-based object recognition condition is not. So this was somewhat surprising, and we have some ideas why this might be. So for example, one option could be that for intact object recognition, the outline shape, the object at a higher level acts as sort of the context for the internal features of the object. So in line with, for example, this perception cycle hypothesis that I showed you earlier, participants might have a guess what the object could be, and then they might test this hypothesis by sending feedback to earlier visual cortex. For example, they might initially guess that this could be a squirrel. If that's the case, then it should have some eyes, it should have a particular texture, and this hypothesis might be tested by sending feedback to early visual cortex, which could happen then around this 200 millisecond time window. Whereas for the context-based condition, this feedback is happening from scene-selective cortex to object-selective cortex and no longer requires early visual cortex. But of course, this is relatively speculative.
Marius, I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you go back one slide real quick? Yeah, so I mean, this is really cool. I was wondering, can you just explain again why I didn't quite understand why TMSing LOC should have a greater effect at the later delay, or why it does. I mean, clearly you predicted it and it does, but I was that LOC is feeding back to the scene area, but isn't there also, like, is it LOC going back to OPA, or wouldn't you also maybe think like OPA is projecting onto LOC? So is it like an asymmetric?
So we're thinking that the OPA is projecting to LOC, so that the OPA, just like the PPA, they're part of the same system, so I'm just treating them as similar here. The OPA representing the scene is providing input to LOC at a later time window. So the OPA, the contribution of the OPA is actually happening before the contribution of the LO.
But in the isolated scene, the LO happens earlier.
In the isolated scene, yeah, there's only this. So there's a shared involvement of LO in isolated and context-based recognition. So in the intact object recognition condition, the LO is fully responsible for object recognition. So that's happening in LO around 200 milliseconds, and it's done. Whereas in the context-based condition, LO is representing, these ambiguous object features, but that's not all it does, because it then is also involved in this disambiguation stage that ultimately leads to recognition. That is a little bit later. But I agree that this last time point didn't necessarily have to be lower than the middle time point. It could have also been equal. I would have been equally happy. So just to schematize it here, to summarize it, so there's this in this intact object condition, the information reaches early visual cortex, is then sent to object-selective cortex, and there's some feedback going on between object-selective cortex and early visual cortex. And by 260 milliseconds, we don't see any further involvement of any of these regions in this process. Whereas for this context-based object recognition, again, information comes in early visual cortex. This is then sent to both scene-selective cortex and object-selective cortex. And then this information from the scene-selective cortex is feeding back into object-selective cortex to disambiguate ultimately this object representation there. And that is causally involved. This late stage is necessary for object recognition, as we've shown here with TMS. Again, this interaction between OPA and LOC could be direct, but of course could also be going through other brain regions that we cannot tell. So to summarize, we provided evidence for two routes to object recognition. One being this isolated intact object recognition, and the other being this context-based object recognition. And these are each characterized by feed-forward and recurrent processing, but involving different brain regions at different time points. And in general, these results confirm this distinction between scene and object-selective regions, but also point to interactions between these systems. And it is these interactions that ultimately support context-based recognition. And I would argue much of our recognition in daily life relies on this interaction between these pathways, because we typically see objects within context. And that's it for now. Thank you.